On Father's Day weekend, 1969 six-year-old Dennis Martin, his brother, his father and his grandfather headed up to the Smoky Mountains to go camping. This was a family tradition on Father's Day, and they were really excited about it. They get to the same campsite they always use. They set up, they have a wonderful first night, they camp out. And the next day, another camper in the area happened to walk by and saw that Dennis and his brother were playing there, and so this camper had kids as well. And he asked Dennis's father, "Hey, would it be okay if I brought my kids by? They're the same age as your sons and they can just play together." Dennis's father says, "Sure, bring them down." And so the man goes, gets his kids. They come back, and before long, all the kids are playing hide and seek. Now, Dennis's father would say that he had an eye on Dennis the whole time. He was just at a distance, but watching his son to make sure he didn't get lost. And so at one point, all the kids are hiding from the parents. And, at some point the parents say, "Okay, show yourselves." And all the kids except for Dennis show themselves. And Dennis's father has watched Dennis go behind a particular tree. He watched him do it. He was watching the whole time. And so when they said, "Come on out," and he didn't come out, he actually wasn't that concerned because he knew exactly where his son was. And then after a few moments, he yelled to his son directly and starts walking over and says, "Dennis, come out, Dennis. I know you're behind the tree." And when he finally got over there, Dennis wasn't there. Dennis's father immediately starts running off into the woods screaming for his son, and he actually ends up running almost 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, just hollering for his son, and he can't find him. And then the rest of the family had broken up and was searching the area because they think he couldn't have gone very far. He was literally just here. And Dennis's father had said before, "I watched him go behind the tree. I watched him. I don't know where he is, but I watched him go behind the tree." And so they're searching everywhere, and Dennis is gone. So a huge search, in fact, the biggest search in park history, ensues with 1,500 searchers that included the Army Green Beret. So the Special Forces got involved. They are combing a 60 square mile plot. They're looking everywhere, and there is nothing, there is no trace, there's no scent, there is nothing connected to Dennis Martin anywhere. And so they go back to Dennis's father, and they're like, "You have to tell us what you saw." Again, this doesn't add up. If you were looking at the tree and he was right there, how is it that he has just vanished into thin air? But no one knew that was it. No one knows what happened. There's no closure. He's just gone. And they never knew what happened to him years later when David Pitus was doing his research for Missing 411 and was researching the Dennis Martin case. He interviewed other families that had been at the campground at the same time that Dennis had gone missing. And one of those families was the Key family, and they had asked a park ranger where they could go on the campground where they might be able to see some bears. And so the park ranger obviously said, "Be careful, but you can go over here to this section of the campground and you might see a bear." And so they head over there and they're looking for bears, and one of their children hears a scream, or thinks he hears a scream, and kind of directs the family to look in the direction of the scream. And from their vantage point, they could see up onto the side of this mountain where there was, call it sparse trees all over the mountain. So you could kind of see in between the trees, and they saw what looked like a bear running along the mountainside, but with something slung over its shoulder. Except the interesting thing about this bear was the father was quoted as saying that it didn't really act like a bear. It was acting more like a human. The way it was running, it looked, hairy and like an animal. But it was running and dodging between trees. It was holding this what looked like a child over its shoulder. It had it acted almost like a human. And so you have a bee-man that has been spotted by the Key family, and they bring this up to the investigators that are looking into the dentist Martin case. And, obviously the Dennis Martin investigators, they don't take this seriously. They think that they're just, saying some ridiculous thing for attention or whatever it is. So It never really was entered into the case with Dennis Martin. It wasn't until the missing 411 cases that it was ever connected, but there really was a family that claims to have seen a bear man carrying a child about an hour after Dennis Martin had gone missing, in the same area where Dennis Martin had gone missing in the spring of 1952. 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing with his siblings outside of his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. And when the kids were all called in to have lunch, Keith was nowhere to be found. And so the siblings and the family went out and did a curtsy search looking for Keith. And when nothing turns up, they call in authorities and a full-fledged search is launched for Keith. There's no sign, there's nothing. And 4 miles away from the ranch, they find several hours later some footprints that look like they might belong to a 2-year-old. And they start tracking those footprints and they go on for miles and miles, and then they just kind of stop. And it wouldn't be until the next day, 12 miles away from the ranch, that they would ultimately find Keith, surprisingly. Keith, who had disappeared with not enough clothing to be out in sub-zero temperatures with snow on the ground and being 2 years old. He wasn't prepared for a night out. He was found alive, face down, 12 miles away. His jacket and his hat had been stacked neatly next to him, and he had scratch marks all over his face, but he was unhurt. When asked, what happened? He's 2 years old. He had said a cat scratched him, and he kept repeating that a cat had scratched him. That was the only thing that he could articulate. No one knew how a 2-year-old in the span of 20 hours could have moved in the middle of the night 12 miles away. Les Stroud, who's a very accomplished doorsman, he's the star. He is Survivor Man. He actually, because of this case, went out and tried to actually cover the distance in the allotted time. You have 20 hours to cover this 12 miles, and he couldn't do it. And he even said, it's not possible for a 2-year-old to have covered this distance, let alone survived the exposure to the elements in the time that he was out there. But somehow he did. And, years and years later, Keith was interviewed, because now he's a grown man. He was interviewed about what happened, and he has no idea. He has no memory of it. At the end of 1973, 19-year-old Charles McCullers, who was an amateur photographer, had been doing a West Coast tour of the United States, going to all the different national parks to photograph beautiful scenery, and by January of 1974, he was in Oregon and wanted to go to Crater Lake, where he wanted to take pictures of Crater Lake. So he asked his friend, who had a terrain vehicle, to take him out to Crater Lake, because his van, which is this VW beat-up old van, it couldn't have made it out that far. And as his friend is driving him out to Crater Lake, Charles says to him kind of jokingly, of huge problems with that theory. One, Bart, his friends at least would say, and people that knew him would say, he would never get snuck up on by a large predator. He was so accomplished in the wilderness, he was always a step ahead of everything around him. So the idea that he would just be sitting there one day and a bear would just happen to sneak up on him is pretty far-fetched. Also in the area where his teeth and some of his bones were found, there was no sign of what they call a death struggle, where you're fighting for your life, you're smashing into everything. There's none of that. There's no marking on the ground or in the surrounding areas that a large predator had attacked him. Also, his camp had food out in the open, and if a large predator had come through like a bear after it finished with Bart, it would have raided the campsite, and it didn't. And so the way this was left was he was attacked and eaten by a predator. But nobody believes that, because that wouldn't happen to Bart, and the circumstances around his campsite didn't really add up. In 2002, Christopher Tompkins was working as a surveyor, and he was assigned to this 4-man survey crew that was working in Harris County, Georgia, and they were walking along this road spaced about 50 feet apart, all four of them, and Chris was the last one in line, and the third one in line would later tell investigators and police that as they were walking along the road, he would periodically turn around to, just for a quick second, make sure Chris was still there. And as they're walking along with no sound or any indication that anything's happened, he turned around, saw Chris, kept walking. Few minutes later, turned around, and Chris is gone. The third guy hails the other two, and they go and they're like, where did Chris go? They're looking down the road, like maybe he stopped, maybe he stepped off the trail, but they can't see him. And they go back to, they start walking down the road towards where he would have been. And they find on the ground a pile of loose change and some of his tools that would have been in his pockets. And then they see one of his boots stuck in the barbed wire, because there's a little barbed wire fence that was running the length of this road. One of his boots was stuck in the barbed wire, and there was nothing else. They searched the area, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign of him. And it didn't make any sense to the people in the survey crew, especially the guy who was third in line, who was like, I literally saw him a minute ago, and there's no way he could have gotten away without me hearing or seeing some indication of where he was, but there was no sign of him, and he was gone. So after this huge investigation, they don't find any sign of him, and that's it. They're just like, yeah, he's gone. They did find, 9 months later, they found his other boot near a swamp 900 yards away, but it didn't provide any more clarity into what happened to him. However, if you look at the pile of loose change and things that were in his pockets that were on the road, it indicates that at some point he may have been turned upside down. And if you think about the entirety of all of these strange stories, where the idea being someone could be hunting humans, just picture in your head Chris Tompkins walking along and something flipping him upside down, dumping the contents out, and then being gone in a matter of a minute where no one can see where they went. These 5 stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of others that are covered in the Missing 411 series. And while many people believe that all of the cases and Missing 411 and any others that ultimately are considered strange inside of these national parks have a rational explanation, even if we don't know what it is, whereas another group believes that this Missing 411 phenomenon is an indication that something is hunting humans in the national parks across North America. Some say Bigfoot, some say aliens, some say something else. But paranormal is certainly the other camp in terms of trying to explain away what these strange disappearances